Okay, we're going to talk about some of the most significant events and decisions that were made during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. And of course, one of the most famous and one of the most unprecedented decisions was the choice to make the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So you'll notice that the pink area here on the map captures all of the Louisiana territory that had belonged to the French prior to its purchase in 1803. We know the story of Lewis and Clark, who were sent to explore the territory. They mapped it out, brought back samples of flora and fauna, encountered Native American tribes, arguably were kept alive by Sacagawea, one of the most important female figures in early American history. The Louisiana Purchase was really unprecedented because no U.S. president had ever made a territorial purchase like that. Now, Jefferson got a great deal, $15 million, which is a good deal at the time, and a good deal by today's measure, of course. And the reason he got such a good deal is at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, the French were being governed by Napoleon, whose empire was becoming really too big to keep control over. Napoleon had brought his troops to Haiti to try to put down a rebellion that was taking place there. You might remember Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Rebellion. So the French are there attempting to put down the rebellion. And the plan was that once Haiti was stable, the French troops would sail to Louisiana and they would make their way sort of throughout the Louisiana Purchase territory and reoccupy the land that had belonged to the French, but that very few French people were actually living in. But at the time that they were in Haiti, it was midsummer and yellow fever had broken out, and Napoleon lost so many of his troops that he was unable to launch a reinvasion of the Louisiana territory, and so he decides to cut his losses and sell the land to Thomas Jefferson. So the purchase doubles the size of the United States, but it doesn't mean that immediately all Americans just spread out and had double the living space. Getting to the Louisiana Territory was a challenge. It meant crossing the Appalachian Mountains, which wasn't realistic for most people, or sailing, which was very expensive. Some additional political changes that take place under Jefferson, of course, the first really being that a president set a precedent for making a big land deal. Jefferson changed several laws. He made it much easier to become an American citizen. The naturalization law had been 14 years. He reduced that to 5. He created a procedure by which territories could become states. They would have to hold a convention and write a constitution to achieve statehood. He oversees the writing of the 12th Congressional Amendment, which says that electors can choose their VP and their president separately, rather than simply having the second place victor become the vice president. And Congress also writes laws demanding a more structured, established military. One of the most revealing pieces of evidence left behind by Thomas Jefferson that tells us about his life is his epitaph. So this is his tombstone. The tombstone is erected at Monticello, Jefferson's home, and he chose the statement that would be written on it. So these are Jefferson's words. And he wanted his epitaph to say, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." Do you notice that anything is missing here? Well, you might notice that he makes absolutely no mention of the fact that he was the 3rd president of the United States. Jefferson was extraordinarily self-critical and self-conscious. And to his credit, when he was self-critical about his presidency, he was largely correct. Because while Jefferson was a brilliant man, he was not an extremely effective executive. Jefferson was known for changing his mind often. And while we might, I personally think that being able to change your mind, to ask questions, to learn new information is healthy, Jefferson was often criticized for the fact that when it came to making difficult decisions, he spent so much time seeking out other opinions and considering and changing his mind and going back and forth, that oftentimes his cabinet felt that he was too indecisive to be president, and he took a lot of that criticism to heart. So this brings us to the election of 1808. James Madison, who was really Thomas Jefferson's protege, is elected after him. James Madison is a Federalist, which is sort of unusual because Madison had, again, learned a great deal and been really mentored by Thomas Jefferson, but Madison becomes more of a Federalist president than a Democratic Republican, in spite of being a Virginian, in spite of working so closely with Jefferson. And in fact, he had been one of the authors of the Federalist Papers alongside Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. He's known as the father of the Constitution. He oversaw the Constitutional Convention and was instrumental in building in the Bill of Rights. But James Madison has a complex presidency because he inherits a very difficult relationship with Great Britain. Britain had again begun to impress U.S. merchant ships to sort of corner and come aboard U.S. merchant vessels and steal their goods and sometimes even kidnap their sailors. Jefferson had attempted to penalize Europe by creating an embargo act which would ban the importation of some European goods and levy an enormous tax on others. All that really did was anger British and other European importers and create a black market of goods that were heavily taxed. Madison's first Congress tries to respond to British impressment by banning trade with Britain and then banning trade with France, and then actually ends up deciding that that cost Americans so much money that they then reopened trade with both countries, making Madison appear somewhat weak and indecisive. Now, this was called a non-intercourse act, which is simply claiming that there will not be any formal trade agreement or relationship between one country and another. But all of this back and forth creates a lot of wear and tear on the relationship between the U.S. and its European, once partners and now enemies. And by 1812, once James Monroe is president, Congress will declare war on Britain. So this brings us to the War of 1812, often referred to as the Forgotten War, because while many Americans know about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, what comes in between the War of 1812 is significant in our defining our own sense of nationalism. Now, if you were in Canada right now, this is something you'd spend a lot of time on. This is one of the most significant events in Canadian history. It's a little bit less influential for Americans, but it's still important to discuss. So the War of 1812 has many causes. For one thing, there are what we refer to as hawks in Congress, people who are more aggressive, more eager to use the military to prove our strength, who want to claim land in Canada and Florida, and they think provoking a war is the way to do it. There's anger over British impressment, there's anger over British trading blockades, and there's also anger over the fact that the British had actually been arming Native American tribes to encourage them to be hostile towards Americans. If you take a look at this map, you can see that by and large, this is a war that is fought on the water, and you'll notice these forts in the Great Lakes area and the area between the U.S. and Canada. Canadians were heavily affected by this war as well, which is why this is very significant to their history. During the War of 1812, the battles themselves, there's lots of interesting stories about battles out at sea. Andrew Jackson first comes on the stage at the Battle of New Orleans, but one of the best stories from the war is of the British burning Washington. The British attempt to burn really as much of the capital as they possibly can in 1814. Dolly Madison, who is the wife of James Madison, of course, manages to save this very famous portrait of George Washington as all the people working in the White House are hastily grabbing everything they can to get out of the White House to save the most valuable pieces that are in it. The Library of Congress is burned down. In fact, Thomas Jefferson died in an enormous amount of debt because he donated his personal library to the Library of Congress to replace it, and then he decides he wants all his books back, so he buys second copies of all of them. The reason that I do think it's important, and that historians think it's important, to talk about the War of 1812 is it's the first time that we see a sense of American nationalism. You might remember nationalism from world history too, that idea of not just being patriotic, but of believing that your country is superior or better than other nations, and that it should be actively proving that. You can see here a very popular graphic from 20th century interwar history, individual nations with their own colors, their own flags. Nationalism is a sense of individuality and uniqueness that a nation's heritage, culture, traditions should be imposed on other countries. So the U.S. begins to cultivate a sense of unity and nationalism during the War of 1812. And that's really purposeful, because during wartime, when the country is young, the country is fragile, it's important, Madison knows how important it is to keep people together. So simple symbols, songs, simple stories and myths that can be passed down become part of American iconography. So during the War of 1812, America adopts a new version of a flag. Now, the first American flag had been adopted by Congress in 1777. You've all been taught it was sewn by Betsy Ross. That might be true, but there's not a lot of definitive proof. And the flag has changed over time. You can see here some examples. Now, what's really interesting about the history of the flag, especially lately, we've been hearing a lot of talk about what respecting the flag should look like. But actually, the U.S. Constitution has laws. Title IV, Chapter 1, Code 8 are what are referred to as flag laws. These are federal laws. Obviously, we don't really enforce them because they're difficult to enforce. But federal flag laws indicate what is respect for the flag. So the flag should never be displayed with the Union side down, should never touch the ground or the floor, it should never be carried flat, should never be part of apparel, it shouldn't be part of housewares, of a logo, should not be pinned or cut, should never be used as a bag or a plate or any form of storage. So when we think about people's definition of what is and is not respecting the flag, we already have those. We already have laws for respect for the flag. People just tend to break them. Here's some more. In fact, the only time that it's legal to wear an American flag on clothing is on a military or first responders uniform. Fort McHenry is a very famous site in the history of the War of 1812. You might know it as the place where Francis Scott Key first observed the shelling of Baltimore by a British fleet. There's still the flag that had originally hung there preserved at the National Museum of American History, and that's the flag that he writes the Star-Spangled Banner about. But the Star-Spangled Banner did not become a national anthem until 1931. Uncle Sam is an icon developed during the War of 1812. There's a number of different stories. You can read this one here if you'd like, about where Uncle Sam comes from, but he becomes sort of this figure to rally around and to encourage a sense of American unity and spirit. He replaces a previous female figure that was used to represent American liberty, and her name is Columbia. You can see her here. The Pledge of Allegiance is something you might think had come out of this era. It's actually much younger. It wasn't written until 1892, and different versions of it have been produced since 1892, the most recent in 1954. So, lastly, the effects of the War of 1812. America is somewhat victorious. It's honestly more of a tie, but we claim victory. The Federalist Party basically falls apart. Increased nationalism. Americans stop migrating into Canada, and America also wins the Oregon Territory. And that is it for this presentation.